Every black day I haven't stopped you. I have seen things you wouldn't believe. I have lost things you will never understand. If you want my life, come and get it!
You know who I am? I'm the Doctor. The man that stops the monsters. They all lost, burned, and ran. I am what stands between you and them. That's who I am.
Hello everybody and welcome back to my Doctor Who Best Modern Era series. Last time we focused on series 1 through 4 and today we're going to be doing series 5 through 10. That's the Stephen Moffat era of Doctor Who, Matt Smith and Peter Capaldi as the Doctor. Just quickly, I wanted to apologize for not getting a video out, but I just really wanted to get this one right. So let's jump on in with what happened last time. Last time I focused on the 9th Doctor and the 10th Doctor's respective eras, show run by Russell T Davies. So here are my general opinions on those. If you haven't seen the original video, part 1, the link will be in the description, but here is just my general opinions on it as a little recap before we jump into Series 5, headed by Stephen Moffat, our now departing showrunner. For me, Series 5 is a really strong start to an era. I think the 11th hour is really good. Along with The Beast Below, I think it's incredibly underrated as a first companion introductory adventure. Victory of the Daleks, I'm not a big fan of simply because of how the Daleks are handled. The Time of Angels and Flesh and Stone, I think is a bit overrated. I find that two-parter to be fairly average because of how convoluted and complicated I think the Angels became. Unnecessarily, I mean. If you like that, that's fine, but I just wasn't a big fan of it. The story itself is still fine, though. Vampires of Venice is a complete bang-average story. Amy's Choice, a really good one-off adventure. I really like this one. The Hungry Earth and Cold Blood, I think it gets a little too much hate from our new showrunner, Chris Chibnall. I think it's a well-told story, if not that original. Vincent and the Doctor is an instant classic, whereas The Lodger is a bit of a comedic, nothing story. It's fine. It's just average. It's mainly filler. It's that low-budget episode you get in most of the series up until the Capaldi era. The Pandorica opens and the Big Bang as a finale to the series started off really well. The Pandorica opens is a very strong semi-finale to this entire arc that's been going on throughout the series. Everything in this series is handled really well, and it's very clear that Stephen Moffat paid a lot of attention to what he was writing and to what he was doing, and knew where he wanted to go by the end of this series, unlike some of his others in the future, which we'll talk about. The Big Bang, however, while it did have a really good setup in the Pandorica Opens, does fall into a lot of future Moffat tropes that we are now used to, and it is just overly convoluted for the sake of being convoluted, which is a lot of the Stephen Moffat era at times. But it's not bad, and it does conclude the arc in a satisfying way. It's an average finale. That doesn't mean the series as a whole is average at all. It's a very strong series. It's one of my favorite series of the show. Matt Smith as the Doctor is spellbinding in the role. Karen Gillan brings fresh life to the companion that we've seen throughout this new series of Doctor Who. She's just much different and fresh compared to what we got with Russell T Davies. Just their combination is fantastic, and it's one of the big drives of this series. It's where the momentum comes from. It's the Doctor-companion relationship, along with the arc with the cracks in time. It was fine. It was a good arc. Yeah, that's basically how I feel about Series 5. Really strong, a really good start. It was a bit bumpy, but that's understandable. It was a completely new take on the show, and very enjoyable. So overall, Series 5 had 7 good episodes, 5 average episodes, 1 bad episode, and a very good arc to begin the Stephen Moffat era and Matt Smith's time as the Doctor. But now we jump into Series 6. Series 6 blasts onto our screen with an epic 2-part premiere that we've never really had in New Who at all. And it was amazing. It sets up this really interesting arc with the Doctor's death and everything about it. New villains like the Silence, very creative. After that, we get a bit of a bump with the Curse of the Black Spot, but that's to be expected in a series. You're always going to have a little average in there. The Doctor's Wife is amazing. I think it's a bit overrated myself, but I still find it really good. The Rebel Flesh and the Almost People is a very average two-parter. It's very boring in parts and stretches a bit too long. A Good Man Goes to War is the culmination of the arc that we've had so far. Everything's been building to this semi-finale before we get to a gap between the series, which I think was an interesting idea. Ultimately, it failed in this series. I do think the story is overrated, though. I'm not a big fan of it. I think it does fine, though. I think Good Man Goes to War is just average. Episode 8, 9, terrible. We had so much momentum ending A Good Man Goes to War, and then it just completely hits a brick wall. And Let's Kill Hitler is a cringy, dreadful experience. It has a tiny moment. The best moment I can remember is when they have like a reference to previous companions, and I was like, oh, that's cool. And that was it. That was the only thing I remember from that story that I liked. I have paid a great deal of attention to my choices and how I'm going to rate these stories, and this one is just bad, along with Night Terrors, which is also bad. It had moments of atmosphere. That's all I can give it, but I still find it bad because it was trying to be scary and it really just wasn't. And if that's your whole point of your story, then you failed, and it's bad. I don't like it. We finally get something in The Girl Who Waited and The God Complex. These stories saved the latter half of this series. If it wasn't for these two stories, Series 6 I think would be looked at a lot worse in people's eyes. I know some people actually really like Series 6, but The Girl Who Waited and The God Complex elevated the crap that was surrounding it. We had Let's Kill Hitler and Night Terrors and Closing Time and The Wedding of River Song. And I'm not saying because they're surrounded by garbage, that's why they're good. They're actually really strong on their own. If they were paired at the first half of the series, they would still be amazing. They're really good stories. I love them. But as I mentioned now, Closing Time and The Wedding of River Song are dreadful experiences. Closing Time is filler in the worst way possible when you're trying to have this arc have some kind of meaning to your audience again. This is the episode before the finale, and nothing. There's nothing there. It's also insulting as a Cyberman story. And in The Wedding of River Song, I think enough people have documented their hatred for this story, and I don't hate it. I just think it's terrible, which is a theme in many Moffat's finales. But I'm not trying to insinuate that I have a vendetta against Stephen Moffat because I like a lot of his work. But ultimately, Series 6 is a bit of a failure in my opinion. I think it gets some things right, but a lot bad, and the story arc itself is just bad. So overall, Series 6 only had 5 good stories, 4 average and 4 bad. It's one of the weakest series of Doctor Who since it came back in the revival, and a really unfortunate misstep in Matt Smith's era of Doctor Who. And Series 7 does not fare much better. Asylum of the Daleks is another bad Dalek story that mishandles those villains and is just awkward, terrible with the relationship of Amy and Rory. It's a bad premiere and a very awkward misstep for Series 7, just starting out. Dinosaurs on a Spaceship, very average, not something very impressive in my opinion from Chris Chibnall. A Town Called Mercy, I just find it to be the highest tier of average possible. The Power of Three I don't think is as bad as people say, because everything was working really well up until the conclusion, which I think a lot of people now know that really wasn't Chris Chibnall's fault. But moving on to The Angels Take Manhattan, and this series finally has something for us. 5 episodes in, and we finally get a really good episode in Angels Take Manhattan. I think this is the best the Weeping Angels were since Blink. I know a lot of people say it's riddled with plot holes, but I personally don't care. I think it's still really good. The Bells of St. John. As you can see, it says 7 up there. I've blotted out the Christmas specials. I'm going to get to the Christmas specials later. That's why this series looks a bit weird. But The Bells of St. John, I think, is a functional companion introduction story. It's not great. It's just fine. And it just barely gets there to that goodness, in my opinion. The Rings of Akaten is an underrated gem. I think it's great at world building, something that's very lacking in New Who, bar a couple stories, and I just love it. It's not all about the speech at the end. There's plenty in The Rings of Akaten that I love. Cold War, very average. I'm not a big fan of the Ice Warriors, and as this was their introduction for me, it didn't really sway me either way. I just found them to be alright. I didn't find the story to be that good. Same with Hyde. An episode built around being scary that doesn't scare me, I'm not going to call good. The journey to the center of the TARDIS is a weird one. It squanders a really great idea, I think, but not one that I was so excited about to where I would call it bad. Neither is the Crimson Horror. It feels like filler, which is a lot of Series 7. Series 7 feels very filler because of this standalone blockbuster type mentality that Stephen Moffat was going for. Nightmare in Silver mishandles the Cybermen, in my opinion. It doesn't understand them. The Name of the Doctor, though, is a weird surprise as a finale. It's visually interesting and has a lot of cool moments. And it's just good. It's fine. I actually think it concludes Clara's arc quite well. And that's why I do call the arc that is there in Series 7 good, which might come as a shock because there really is no arc. But the Impossible Girl arc, I think it's good. I think it actually works really well in the context of the story. It's a good idea, if not interesting at the very least, and he actually executed it and concluded it well, which is rare with his series. So I will call it good. Overall, Series 7 had 4 good episodes, 7 average episodes, and 2 bad. Whether that's worse than Series 6 is up for debate. It does have less good stories, but it has more average and less bad. So people might not look down on it as much as they would with Series 6, because in my opinion there are more bad episodes in Series 6. But now we enter the Capaldi era with Series 8, and I think it is incredibly underrated as a series for a show that for its past 2 series had been dipping in quality quite drastically. But Series 8, in my opinion, starts off very strongly with 4 awesome stories. I think Deep Breath is an amazing regeneration introduction story to a Doctor into the Dalek. Reinvigorated the Daleks, if not wholly original, because it does take some aspects of Dalek, but in my opinion it's a bit of an extension from the themes that Dalek introduced. And for me, Into the Dalek is just a really enjoyable, action-packed, visually stunning Dalek story. I think it's the best the Daleks have ever looked in the new series. This was the first episode that they had exterminated anyone in like years. It was a breath of fresh air. That's what I can say for Series 8. It was a breath of fresh air. Robot of Sherwood is hilarious, and I think it's the funniest Doctor Who episode Mark Gatiss has ever written, and I think he should stick with that. I think he should stick with comedy or gothic horror. I think that's where he fits in best. Listen, I think, is overrated, and I think people have realized that now for the most part, but I still enjoy it for what it is. Time Heist, I think, is average, along with The Caretaker. It's a bit of a bump, but based on the last 4 episodes we got, I still think this series was going really strong until Kill the Moon, which is just bad. It's, Peter Harness, I don't know what you were thinking. I'm so glad you got better. But this was a really bad story, only to be saved by Mummy on the Orient Express, which is so good. And the defining 12th Doctor story, I think, in Series 8. It fits him so well, it's perfect. Flatline, also written by Jamie Mathieson, who did Mummy. I think it's good, definitely not as good as Mummy on the Orient Express in my opinion, but that just might be because there's less 12 and I love 12. In the Forest of the Night, I think it gets a lot of hate, unnecessarily, but it is still bad. But we get to Darkwater, the semi-finale, and this feels like the Pandorica opens in terms of quality for a great setup to a finale. It's just got a lot of great atmosphere in it. It has a great reveal with the Cybermen and with Missy. I just love this one a lot. And then we lead into Death in Heaven, which, like The Big Bang in Matt Smith's first series, is just an average finale, and I think it squanders a lot of what Darkwater set up. Overall, I think the arc of Series 8 is good, and I am not talking about Missy popping up in episodes randomly, but the real great arc here is the good man question. The character progression of 12 is very present in this series, more than the others, I think. 12 actually does soften up a lot in this series, and I think a lot of people forget that when criticizing his character progression from Series 8 to 9. They think it came out of nowhere, but it was actually set up in these series, I think, quite well. It is my favorite aspect that they've incorporated into the show since 12's been here, and it's the subtle character moments. Those are more present in the show now since 12 started as the Doctor, and I'm really gonna miss it. I gotta say, I'm really gonna miss it because it's very important in Series 9. But we'll get to that in a second because the story arc for Series 8 was good. It had 7 good episodes, 3 average episodes, and 2 bad episodes. I think it's on par with Series 5, if not for creativity. I think Series 5 is more creative, but I think in terms of quality, they're very similar in my opinion. And now we move on to Series 9. And this series to me is a tragedy. It is a tragedy that people do not give this series as much credit as it deserves. We start off with The Magician's Apprentice, which, yes, looking back, is just an average episode. It has a really good start with the Doctor and Davros. Really good stuff. And then somewhere in the middle, I think around the time that we get introduced to Clara on Earth, it really just crawls through the middle and it's full of a lot of filler, but it actually has a really good conclusion and cliffhanger to set up the next story. And that's where we get to The Witch's Familiar, which I will stand by is a really good story. People complain a lot about this one, I think, because of how the Daleks were treated in it. But I don't think they realize that this wasn't a Dalek story, it's a Davros story. And the Doctor and Davros are amazing. Probably the best Doctor and Davros interactions happen in this episode than in all the 50 years of Doctor Who. It's fantastic. And I enjoyed Missy and Clara in this one too. They had a really nice dynamic. It's just fun, emotional, dark. The conclusion is a bit odd, but I'm able to roll with it anyway. So overall, I love the opening two-parter to Series 9. It's epic and it sets up an interesting arc with the hybrid. Moving on to Under the Lake and Before the Flood, one of my favorite Capaldi stories of all of his 3 series. This story is the perfect mash of classic and new Doctor Who. It's based under siege, it's timey-wimey, it's fantastic and thrilling, it's scary, it's fun at times, yes, and 12 and Clara are awesome in it, along with the guest cast, which are very strong, which is rare in Doctor Who these days. I just love this two-parter so much. It made me fall in love with Toby Whithouse. I think he's one of the best writers to ever have written for a new Doctor Who. Series 9 did lose some steam though heading into its middle half. Episodes 5 and 6 introducing Maisie Williams as the character of Me or Ashilda or whatever the hell she was. They are very weak compared to the first 4 episodes in this series. However, they're not that weak in retrospect for me. I find these stories still watchable. They're just average to me. I think there are good bits in there, but ultimately it's very disappointing for Jamie Matheson to give us The Girl Who Died, and The Woman Who Lived is nothing special. It has some great character moments, but the plot is absolutely pointless and almost non-existent. However, I still find them entertaining enough to call average in its very lowest form. So that was the bump in Series 9, but we then skyrocket into episodes 7 and 8, the Zygon Invasion and the Zygon Inversion. What a comeback for Peter Harness. After Kill the Moon, this guy really needed to prove himself, and boy did he ever. This two-parter is fantastic. Not to mention 12 is amazing, and this story actually has a lot of good twists and turns that you don't necessarily see coming. And it's really a great comeback for the Zygons as well. They were kind of nothing in the 50th. They weren't anything special. But here they're actually used, I think, to their greatest possible potential. They're really good in this story. And of course, everyone remembers the speech. The speech is legendary. So overall, I love the Zygon Invasion / Inversion. Great story coming off of The Girl Who Died and The Woman Who Lived, and the momentum for Series 9 was once again picked up, only to be stunted again by Sleep No More. Mark Gatiss assaults our eyes and brains with this confusing mess of a story. However, I still think it's just average. I think this story gets a little too much hate just because it has really good ideas, and I give it credit for doing something different. I actually would have liked a sequel to this story in Series 10. I know it wouldn't have really worked because Clara wasn't there anymore, but I kind of wish Mark Gatiss got a second go at this, because though he didn't handle it well in this story, I feel like there was some potential there to do better the next time. Anyways, it's been a bit bumpy, Series 9. We've had some good, we've had some average, but overall it's been fairly consistent, and I think that's why the series was so loved at the time up to this point. It was good, then it was average, then it was good again. You didn't really have long bouts of average or bad. It was really structured well in terms of quality. I don't know if that was on purpose or an accident, but after Sleep No More, we're greeted by Sarah Dollard's Face the Raven. This story is awesome. Sarah Dollard was the Jamie Matheson of Series 8. That's all I'm going to say. Coming off of the adrenaline rush and emotional roller coaster of Face the Raven, Heaven Sent. Heaven Sent is truly heaven sent. Stephen Moffat, I think, blew everyone's minds with this story. I don't think anyone saw this one coming, actually. Certainly I didn't. I couldn't expect how amazing Capaldi, the writing, the set design, the direction, everything was so fantastic. This story is my favorite story of Doctor Who in all of its 50 years. I love Heaven Sent. I've seen it more times than any story ever. This was a great penultimate episode and set up the finale so perfectly. But unfortunately, Stephen Moffat was not feeling very gracious with the fans and decided to give us Hellbent. Now, I recognize that there are a lot of people who like this story, and it's probably the most divisive story ever. But I still hate it. I give it credit for its ideas and for what it was going for. In fact, I've rewatched Series 9 a lot, and what I've noticed is that this was completely the plan the entire time. For people who say that Moffat pulled this out of his ass at the last minute and completely threw away everything he set up, if you rewatch the episodes, it was all leading to this the entire time. We just really were too focused on the whole hybrid thing to actually see the subtleties that Moffat was actually setting up for Hellbent. And I give him credit for that because I respect Series 9 for its writing and structure, except for its conclusion to the hybrid arc. But I will not hold it against you. If you do love this story, that's completely fine. But unfortunately for me, this story handled a lot wrong in my opinion. And the hybrid is just one of those small things. I'm not even going to talk about the others. The hybrid arc does just become average to me because I do respect the subtleties of how they set up the relationship of Clara and the Doctor being the hybrid. I'm not talking about how they just slap the word hybrid in there. That's not the writing I'm talking about. I'm talking about the subtleties they showed in the relationship in the episodes leading up to Hellbent that would lead you to believe that they are this creature that is going to end the whole of creation. The Doctor and Clara are the hybrid. They set it up pretty well if we look back, but unfortunately I hate the way they concluded it. I think with a few more tweaks, the way they did Hellbent, if they still brought Clara back, I still would have been on board with it if they handled it just slightly differently. But yes, the hybrid arc is just average to me solely because of its conclusion. But overall, I think Series 9 is way up there in some of the strongest series of Doctor Who. It is so unfortunate that Hellbent was so divisive, because if it wasn't, I think it would have been most of the fandom's favorite series of new Doctor Who. It's really a shame that Capaldi's era is going to be looked back on quite poorly by some people because of this episode. I don't think a lot of the people who still hate it have gotten over it. I have gotten over it. I still hate it, but I've gotten over it. So it doesn't really affect my outlook on his era as a whole or Stephen Moffat as a writer. Wow. As you guys could probably tell, I'm very passionate about this series, but it is time to move on. Series 9 to me was an amazing series of Doctor Who, even if its final episode was not up to the quality of its predecessors. The story arc was average. It had 7 good episodes, 4 average episodes, and 1 bad. I don't know if that's a popular opinion or not, but it's mine, and I think Series 9 is a great series, despite its finale. Which means it's time to move on to Series 10, the most recent series of Doctor Who and Peter Capaldi and Stephen Moffat's final. The pilot introduces Bill Potts, the 12th Doctor's new companion, and she is amazing. Pearl Mackie is the best thing about Series 10, other than Peter Capaldi, obviously. I think the pilot is a really stripped back and more simple premiere than of any of Stephen Moffat's in recent memory. I was a little underwhelmed by Heather as the villain, but I still think the story and the 12th Doctor and Bill's relationship is what carries most of Series 10 and this episode specifically. Smile. I think Smile is one of the most underrated episodes of the Peter Capaldi era in terms of quality and how the ideas that this writer had were actually incorporated into it. This story, I don't know, emojis, it sounds awful, but they actually did it really well, and I just love this one, despite its conclusion being a bit rushed. In fact, it was very rushed. I still enjoy it a lot. And it's one of the most fun stories, I think, of the 12th Doctor's era. It's just fun. I love it. Thin Ice, Sarah Dollard's return to Doctor Who. And it is definitely no Face the Raven, but I don't think it was ever supposed to be. It could never hold as much weight as having a companion dying. However, Thin Ice still has some amazing moments and shows Sarah Dollard's understanding of how to write a doctor and their companion and their relationship. That's the best thing about Thin Ice. The plot is simple, just like the pilot and Smile, but this is kind of a theme in Series 10. Stripped back, more simple, easygoing stories. But of course, Stephen Moffat fixes that with some of his. But before we get to that, Knock Knock. Knock Knock is one of my least favorite episodes of the series, but I'm not willing to call it bad just because I did enjoy parts of it enough to where I think it's watchable. However, I think it makes a lot of mistakes in terms of its scares. It really breaks the mood at terrible times. I would look back on this story as good if the conclusion didn't really make the entire thing redundant. Also, it feels heavily edited and chopped down, and that's very clear when you look at some of the deleted scenes. There is one in particular that is absolutely amazing and would do so much just to understand more about what's happening, but it was put on the cutting room floor, unfortunately. Yeah, I think this story is just a victim of editing. It feels rushed, and the conclusion just makes it all feel sort of pointless. So ultimately, because I wasn't scared by Knock Knock and that was its point, I can't give it a good rating, but I do recognize it had a lot of good moments that made up for the lack of, I think, quality that I was looking for from a new writer. Moving on to Oxygen, Episode 5 and Jamie Matheson's entry for Series 10. It is definitely no Mummy on the Orient Express, but it's also definitely not The Girl Who Died. It's definitely on par with Flatline, which is also a good story. I like Oxygen a lot, and I think it has a lot of great ideas, and it's a fun little base under siege story. I think the conclusion is a bit rushed though, and I think that happens a lot in Series 10 for some of these episodes. However, it does make sense, and it doesn't feel redundant when it all finally concludes. Overall, I think Oxygen had a lot of great moments. In fact, I would have liked it to be a bit longer. I think it was just a bit too short, but honestly, it's still good writing from Jamie Matheson, and the twist with the Doctor being blind is fantastic. And it's great to know that that was Jamie Matheson's idea, and kudos to Moffat for rolling with that one. It made Series 10 a lot more interesting. Halfway through Series 10 now, and we have Extremis by Stephen Moffat. This one gets a lot of hate for being too complicated and arc heavy, and while I understand that, I still love this story. It's one of my favorites of Series 10. Stephen Moffat is on point with his atmosphere and ideas and storytelling. This really shows how well of a writer Moffat can be when he focuses on one idea, though he does verge slightly off course at points, which is where the story has problems, and that's with the Vault arc. The incorporation of the Vault arc ultimately makes sense, I think, by the end of it after a couple of rewatches. However, it's jarring, and if it wasn't a part of this story, I think the episode would be a lot better off for it, and I think the fans would agree. However, I enjoyed Extremis so much, and the ideas were so fresh, I think, for Doctor Who. It feels so much more different than the rest of the episodes in Series 10 up to that point. They kind of felt very samey. Thin Ice, Knock Knock, Oxygen. They kind of felt like, oh, I've seen some of this before, but it's got a new twist. However, Extremis feels completely fresh and new, and I think it's a great setup for a three-parter, despite what people still say. The Pyramid at the End of the World is really good and enjoyable from Peter Harness and Stephen Moffat. It's such a shame, though, that The Lie of the Land ruined this three-parter for a lot of people. I still like this three-parter despite its conclusion. However, Toby Whithouse really screwed things up with this one. I don't know what happened. He was such a good writer. If you look at his track record with Under the Lake, Before the Flood, and many great stories before that, The Lie of the Land, though a disappointing conclusion, I still find to be average because the first 20 minutes were good. So good, in fact, that it makes the latter half just feel like a poor imitation of the Rings of Akhaten. You know what I'm talking about if you've seen the conclusion to this story. So ultimately, while this episode does verge on bad, I still think it's average because it had so many great moments throughout the episode. Unfortunately, it just couldn't keep it together by the end of it. The Empress of Mars is the ultimate Mark Gatiss story. It is average. This did not help my opinion of the Ice Warriors at all. I'm sorry, Mark Gatiss, but I could not get on board with this one. It's fine, but it's nothing extraordinary. It's functional, but it's not that interesting. The Eaters of Light is another disappointment. I think The Lie of the Land and The Eaters of Light are the two disappointing stories in this series. We were promised a classic writer. Rona Munro was to write this story, and she did. However, this story feels really uninspired and even a rehash of Survival, which is the story that Rona Munro originally wrote in the classic series. However, I do think it is just average because there are a lot of parts that I enjoy about it. Series 10 is very enjoyable, and that's why there hasn't been a single bad episode so far, and there will not be, because World Enough in Time and The Doctor Falls is the best finale of the Capaldi era, and I think Stephen Moffat's best finale that he's ever written. World Enough in Time is the ultimate Cybermen story, and it's my favorite. I can't think of any Cybermen story that I enjoy more than World Enough in Time. It's a perfect episode. I have no problems with it. John Sim, if he wasn't revealed in marketing, I think this finale would probably be on the status of legendary in the fan base. And I think it actually is. It's still that good that even if the master reveal was spoiled, it was still that good. And I feel so sad for Stephen Moffat, actually. This was such a shame for him because I know that he didn't want John Sim to be spoiled. John Sim didn't want it to be spoiled, neither did Stephen Moffat. No one wanted it to be spoiled, but unfortunately, the BBC had to interfere with this series and thought that they needed to increase viewing figures by revealing John Sim in the trailer. However, we actually had worse viewing figures with this series than the previous, I believe, so that looks pretty bad for the BBC, unfortunately, and it's a real shame for the fans and John Sim and Stephen Moffat. It's just a real shame, but these stories are so good. I think this era is incredibly solid, and it shows in the quality of writing and the acting. Series 10 had 8 good episodes, 4 average episodes, and 0 bad. It had a good story arc with Missy and her arc of becoming good, and it was concluded in the best possible way that I never saw coming, with her choosing to side with the Doctor, even though he'll never know that she did, and she dies because of that. Without hope, without witness, without reward, those are the words that I think define this era of Doctor Who, and all the better for it. Before we can decide, however, which era of the show is the best, we need to talk about the specials. Now, obviously some eras have more specials than others, and that's very clear in the David Tennant era. Of all his specials, though, I'll do this very quickly, they are all good, except Planet of the Dead. I find that one just to be average, but David Tennant has a very strong list of specials. Matt Smith, however, has a bit more of a mixed bag. A Christmas Carol is a good story, however, it's followed poorly a year later with The Doctor, the Widow, and the Wardrobe, but other than that, he has a lot of good specials like The Snowman and of course The Day of the Doctor, which goes without saying. The Time of the Doctor, however, is, I think, an average conclusion to the Smith era, but ultimately still enjoyable. I think Smith deserved more in his era and definitely more in his final episode, but it does have the greatest regeneration scene, in my opinion. Hopefully Twice Upon a Time can top that. But speaking of the 12 Christmas specials, there's only 3, not including Twice Upon a Time, which is coming out very soon. Last Christmas, I think, is good. The Husbands of River Song is an enjoyable Christmas special. The Return of Dr. Mysterio, though, well, an interesting idea, does kind of feel like filler, especially given that it came right after a huge hiatus and was nothing special. So overall, the Tennant specials, 6 good, 1 average. Smith specials, 3 good, 1 average, 1 bad. And the Capaldi specials, 2 good and 1 average. As you might have noticed, Christopher Eccleston did not have any specials, therefore he cannot be included in this list. But I did take into account of this in my final rating of the best modern era. And before I get to what my pick for the best modern era is, let's just take a look back at what we've seen so far in this series of videos. The Eccleston era, though only one series, probably one of the strongest of them all. However, the Tennant era, Smith era, and Capaldi era both have 3 incredible series of Doctor Who. Of course, some better than others. Some interesting comparisons I see: the Capaldi era and the Tennant era seem to have very similar qualities throughout their series. The Smith era starts off really well, but kind of slumps off, only to slightly redeem itself in the end, but not enough, I think, to keep it on par with the Tennant and Capaldi eras. So I think you kind of know what last spot is going to be. If we crunch the numbers, we can see that the Eccleston era has 10 good episodes, 2 average episodes, 1 bad, and 1 good story arc. Of course, because it is just one series, all of this information you already know. However, for the Tennant era, which has 3 series, after crunching the numbers, he had a total of 28 good, 14 average, and 5 bad stories, with a bad story arc, a good story arc, and then an average story arc. A fairly strong era in my opinion. The Smith era, after going through all his series, has 19 good, 17 average, and 8 bad. With 2 good story arcs and 1 bad, I believe that this era is a mixed bag. There's a lot of good, a lot of average, and a significant amount of bad compared to the other eras of the show. Finally, the Capaldi era, 24 good episodes, 12 average episodes, and 3 bad episodes. With a good story arc to begin with, an average in the middle, and another good one to end it. Once again, I think there are a lot of similarities between the Capaldi era and the Tennant era in terms of quality. As you can see, 28, 14, and 5 for Tennant, 24, 12, and 3 for Capaldi. I was very surprised by that comparison actually. It's very similar, and I just find that very interesting. So, in conclusion, after all the number crunching comparisons and series analysis, the worst era of the show is the Smith era. I know this is going to be an unpopular opinion. I love the 11th Doctor and I love his companions, and there's a lot to love about his era, but unfortunately I find it to be a very mixed bag. 19 good episodes, 17 average, and 8 bad. It's just obvious that this was never going to be my favorite era of the show, and when comparing that to Eccleston's one series, you can't really put Eccleston behind him. Though Eccleston does barely qualify as an era, his quality within his one series is so great that I think it boosts him ahead of the Smith era. And that makes him the 3rd best modern era. The top 2 are now obvious and probably have been. The Tennant era, number 2. This might be a shock to some people, although some of you might have seen it coming. 28 good, 14 average, and 5 bad. Why do I think this is the 2nd best modern era? As you can see by my comparisons, these eras are neck and neck in terms of quality. So I think it really comes down to who's your favorite Doctor, and my favorite Doctor is the 12th Doctor, Peter Capaldi. With 24 good episodes, 12 average episodes, and 3 bad. I'm hoping to put 1 more good episode up there when Twice Upon a Time comes out. Peter Capaldi's era has been amazing and has been my favorite of new Doctor Who, and it's such a shame that it's ending, but I can't wait for the new era with Chris Chibnall and Jodie Whittaker. I hope you've enjoyed this series of videos. I can't wait to be bringing you guys more content with Twice Upon a Time coming out soon. I apologize for the delay with this video between the last one that I posted almost a month ago. I'm really sorry about that. Life got really hectic, but I'm glad to have finally gotten all of this information off my chest. I just really wanted to share my opinions of the show with you guys, and now that I've done these 2 very long videos, I hope we can all have more conversations and more debates about Doctor Who. And once again, I look forward to posting more videos on the channel. The next one I'm going to be making is going to be Twice Upon a Time related. I have a couple ideas brewing, but we'll see which one gets posted first. I aim to get it done sometime this week or the next. Who knows? Until next time, guys, thanks for watching.